Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
What's up, guys? Welcome to Sports Spectrum. I am Jason Romano. So glad you're tuning into the show today. Easy way to reach us. You can go right to our website, sportspectrum.com, a great place to start your day with a daily devotional Monday through Friday. And then, of course, a lot of podcasts are there. Almost every single podcast is available over at sportspectrum.com. And then, of course, articles, stories, different stories on the intersection of sports and faith, updated every day over at sportspectrum.com. And if you have an idea for a guest or a story that we should be covering, you can email me directly, jason@sportspectrum.com. We love to hear your feedback, any ideas that you have. A lot of those ideas end up being stories on our website or interviews on our podcast. So please do reach out, jason@sportspectrum.com. Mallory Weggemann is our guest today. She is a record-setting two-time Paralympic swimmer for Team USA. She has set 15 world records and 34 American records and is also the recipient of an ESPY Award, a 15-time world champion, and a Paralympic gold and bronze medalist. Now, she has also served as a commentator on NBC for the Pyeongchang 2018 Paralympic Games, and she's the first female reporter in a wheelchair ever to serve in that capacity. She's an in-demand speaker and has spoken to many large corporations, Fortune 500 companies around the world, and her story is quite the story. Let's just say that. This woman, she's written a new book. It's called Limitless, The Power of Hope and Resilience to Overcome Circumstance, released on March 2nd, 2021. And the story of Mallory Weggemann, it goes back to when she was just shy, a month or two, of her 19th birthday, and her life changed forever. And it led her to being in a wheelchair and paralyzed. She's got a powerful story. God is at the center and walked her through her journey. And she talks about that word hope, that word resilience, and another word that I'm really excited for you to hear her describe and talk about. The word is grit. So Mallory Weggemann is going to be joining us in just a second. First, we want to say thank you to our partners and sponsors today, Compassion International. And listen, you guys have been great in getting involved with a lot of the partners and sponsors that we have here on Sports Spectrum. Our friends, really, when you're talking about Compassion International and what they do, releasing children from poverty, it's such important work. It really is. And all of us are looking for a place to sow into, to pour into, to make a difference. Compassion International is a great place to do that. And right now they have this Fill the Stadium initiative, a professional athlete-led initiative with Compassion to stand in the gap by providing food, medical care, and support for 70,000 children who right now are left without a sponsorship because of the pandemic and COVID-19. 70,000 children in Compassion who are currently unfunded and currently in dire situations. So you can make a difference and donate right now. Go to fillthestadium.com to learn more, fillthestadium.com. We're also thankful to our other sponsors today, Water Mission. Again, if you're looking for a place to sow into, to donate to know that your money is going to go somewhere and make a difference, Water Mission is the place. I donate to Water Mission every month. It's an important ministry for me to get involved with because, listen to these numbers, there are 4.4 billion people around the world who lack access to adequate sanitation and 2.1 billion people that lack access to safe water. Did you hear what I just said? 4.4 billion people do not have adequate sanitation around the world. 2.1 billion, with a B, people do not have access to safe water, things that you and I take for granted every day. And this is why I donate. This is why I'm a part of Water Mission, because this is a global water crisis that is in existence right now, and COVID-19 has only magnified these issues. So Water Mission, what they do, providing urgently needed safe water, sanitation, and hygiene solutions to refugee settlements and other vulnerable communities, they are worth sowing into and partnering with. Check out watermission.org to learn more. Watermission.org. All right, let's get to our conversation with Mallory Weggemann, a Paralympic gold medalist and world champion swimmer, joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. Mallory, welcome to Sports Spectrum. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's so good to see you. So good to talk to you. I'm excited about your story. And for those who don't know your story, let's start right with what that story is. January 21st, 2008. I'm sure it's a date you will never forget. And it's written a lot about in this book, Limitless. And we'll talk about the book in a little bit. But why don't you give us a little background on your story and leading up to what took place on the 21st of January, 13 years ago?
13 years ago. It's crazy to think about that. You know, I grew up in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I'm the baby of 3 girls. And I joke that before my injury happened, life was just pretty average. You know, I was a competitive swimmer and, like I said, one of 3. And, you know, I was looking at what life after high school graduation would look like for me. And I was kind of doing a gap year at home with my parents, staying put. I was going to a local community college because I really wanted to transfer out of state into a school of journalism, as that was kind of my area of focus I was looking at. And what happened that year was not what I planned when I thought I was going to do a kind of pseudo gap year, if you will. And on January 21st, 2008, it was actually Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So I had the day off from class. It was our second week of spring semester. And I went into a health clinic to receive what was to be my 3rd and final epidural injection. I was getting these injections to help treat back pain. That previous year, my senior year of high school, I got shingles. And I randomly kind of got this condition that leaves residual nerve pain as a result. And so we started treating it with epidurals. And on January 21st, 2008, I walked into that clinic and I never walked out. I was left paralyzed as a result from the procedure and complications. And it was kind of the start of everything new. I talk about that day a lot. And I think the biggest thing that stands out, especially 13 years later now, is just the uncertainty that came, right? Like everything I knew changed in quite literally the blink of an eye. I mean, my dad was in the room with me that day. I was wide awake. I remember every little detail. And it's so stark to me just how quickly life can change at times. And I think that's something, unfortunately, we all intimately know in our own journeys of having those pivoting moments and those sudden moments of impact that kind of change the trajectory of where we're going. And for me, January 21st, 2008 was that day.
Wow. I mean, there's so much there to unpack. And you write about a lot of it in the book, Limitless. Again, the power of hope and resilience to overcome circumstance. So you overcome and you have this power to move forward. But I have to imagine you're almost 19 at that point? That's got to be so it's so confusing, anger, you know, all of these emotions, frustration. Can you kind of take us through sort of this, the mindset of where you're kind of moving forward initially? And I'd also like to ask, if I could, where your faith was at this point. Did you grow up in a Christian home? Did you have a faith, or was that really not, in your life at that point?
Yeah, those are great questions. And they're all things I experienced. I mean, anger was a big part of that. Wondering, why me? I mean, thinking to, what if I would have just rolled back over that morning and not woken up and said, let's just not do this 3rd one and just kind of see how it goes. And, for me, I grew up, I said I grew up baby of 3 girls, and we grew up here in Minnesota in a Lutheran home church, and our church community was a really big part of our life. I did mission trips. My mom was the youth leader on them for years for my sisters and I. And it was a big piece of my childhood. And I think in those early days, it was kind of this like back and forth of realizing, I'd been through some things with my family before my paralysis with a loved one who fought life and death. And I talk about that in the first chapter of Limitless. And I think in so many ways, because we as a family had gone through that, as traumatic as January 21st was for us, I was still alive. Like, I wasn't fighting for my life. I wasn't, knocking on death's door. We had been through that. And so in perspective to what we had faced as a family, well, it was earth shattering. I mean, it was, like you said, 2 months before my 19th birthday.
Yeah.
There was also that perspective that we had seen worse. And so I think that helped guide us. And I was really fortunate to have such an incredible community wrap themselves around me on day one. I mean, don't get me wrong, waking up on January 22nd in a hospital with no sensory from my waist down and no control of the lower half of my body was terrifying. Anyone can probably imagine what that fear must be. And it at times was all consuming, and that frustration, especially after everything we had been through, of like, why does God let bad things happen to good people? And like, we go through those moments where it's just like, you just don't get it. But then I also look at it and I realize, but he also put these incredible people in my life who filled my hospital room with color and helped guide me forward when I didn't have anything to lean on. And they were my people that gave me a path forward and gave me hope at a time when everything felt pretty hopeless.
Mallory Weggemann is joining us here on Sports Spectrum. And again, the new book, Limitless, is releasing March 2nd, 2021. So walk us through that process of, I guess, because it feels so final, which shouldn't be the case at 19, right? Because you're still, or almost 19, you still have so much left. And obviously here you are now, and God has done some incredible things in your life. And we're going to get to all those amazing things in a second. But at that point, you're probably thinking, okay, my life's over at 18 years old. But then there's a point where a pivot happens. You use that word. We use that word a lot, by the way, in 2020 with the pandemic, that we've all had to pivot, but you had to make the ultimate pivot here and say, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to move forward here. Walk us through initially what that process was like to kind of accept it and then move forward.
Yeah. It was a fight. And in the early stages, that fight was just relearning how to do the simple things. I had to learn how to sit up again. I had to learn how to get dressed, how to transfer myself from a bed to a wheelchair, how to maneuver in a wheelchair. I mean, literally everything that I thought I knew how to do in life, I had to relearn how to do. Just being able to balance while brushing my teeth, like all those little things. And so I think for me, those baby steps became part of what gave me the strength. Like each time I learned how to do something, I remember the first time I put on a pair of sweatpants, it was like a grueling 45-minute session just to put a pair of pants on. But I learned how to do that. And then I learned how to put shoes on. And then I learned how to independently transfer without help. And each step that I had that I was able to like get a little bit of that independence back, I felt myself moving forward. And I think for myself, the ultimate pivot point was when I returned to the water. And I had only been home from the hospital for, 5 weeks at that point. I was still figuring out what this all meant for my life moving forward. I was terrified on any given day because everywhere I went was the first time I had been there since I was walking. And so I was constantly faced with these memories of last time I was here, how different life was. And so the first weekend in April of 2008, I was now settled in my room downstairs at my parents' house that they had kind of retrofitted for me for accessibility. And I wheeled into the kitchen and my sister was reading our local newspaper, the Star Trib. And in it, there was an article about the 2008 Beijing Paralympic trials for swimming. And admittedly, at that point in time, my family and I knew nothing about the Paralympic movement. We really didn't know anything about adaptive sport. And so, of course, we were intrigued and we looked up what are the Paralympics and realized it's the second largest sporting event in the world, second to the Olympic Games, and runs in parallel just for athletes with physical disabilities.
Yeah.
And we were in awe, and so we went to the pool that night to watch. It was being held at the University of Minnesota. And I didn't go voluntarily. Like, let's not sugarcoat this story. I was very much so of the mindset, like, that's all cool, but I'm hanging out at home. It's snowing out. It's April. I'm learning how to get around on four wheels. No, we're not going to the University of Minnesota campus in the middle of snow.
Yeah.
And sure enough, we did, because we all know how supportive and loving and sometimes pushing families can be. And so we went that night, and it was my pivoting moment. Within, 2 days later, 48 hours, I got back in the water for the first time on April 8th. And I mean, that was 2.5 months after I was injured. And returning to the water for me was like going home. I was so scared, but those first few strokes, I felt alive. And it was the black line was my place to grieve and heal and process. And in so many ways, it was my sanctuary. Like, that's what that black line gave me. And so I went back to it every single day. And here we are all these years later, and I'm still doing it.
Yeah, and you're doing it very, very well, if I might add, if you're a gold medalist and certainly a world champion. You wrote about that in page 127, which is, I'm not going to give away the book. I want people to go buy it and read it. But you just use the word swimming saved my life after your paralysis. And I think that was a really unique way to describe what took place for you. But then it's one thing to kind of see and watch the Paralympics, and it's another thing to get back in the water and overcome that fear. But it's another thing to go on to become a world champion and a gold medalist. And by 2012, you're competing at the Paralympic Games, and you've already held 15 world records, 34 American records. I have to imagine so much took place in those 4 years or so to where you went from, maybe just stepping into the water to realize I'm pretty good at this, and let's go forward here, and let's see if we can compete and do some pretty amazing things. What was that time like for you?
It was really interesting because for me, the water was my way to fight back against this notion of, I felt like society instantly looked at me differently just because of that singular moment in time in my life. And now I rolled into a room rather than stepped into a room. And in that act of wheeling and being in a wheelchair, it felt like before anyone knew anything about me, they knew first that I was in a wheelchair. And with that came limitations. And I hated that. I hated that idea that I was now looked at as being physically incapable of things purely because of one split second in time in my life. And so I loved swimming because every time I got faster, it was me fighting back against that notion. And so in a lot of ways, it was my way of grieving, but also like fighting back against what happened in a way. And that was part of the grieving process for me. And so I remember when I broke my first American record, I was like, that's so cool. Let's do it again. And it instantly became a game. And that's how I racked up 34 in 4 years. I just kept looking for the next one because I thought, gee, if I can break an American record, I must not be all that disabled. And then maybe if I can break a world record, I certainly must not be all that disabled. And it was just my way of, yes, I'm a woman with a disability, but I'm not disabled. And that was my way to fight back against that and prove that you can live with a spinal cord injury. You can live with a disability. You're not suffering from it. And that grief process kind of bounced back and forth. There were days that I felt like Superwoman, and then there were days where it just hit me square in the face. And in that time, I also had to learn how to forgive. I mean, you can imagine what happened that day certainly wasn't what we planned for. And there was a lot of anger that I held for that. And I knew I would never get the closure that I wanted. I knew that I had to find a way to create my own closure. And I also knew that in order for me to move forward with my life in a meaningful way, I had to find the courage to forgive for no one else other than just simply because I needed to let go. And so that was a big part of that process going into London, was this back and forth of literally breaking records and then going into my little bubble with my journal and just processing. And so when London came, I mean, it was like watching my entire journey come full circle and seeing everything that we had fought through and everything I had worked through to get to that point of healing.
Sports Spectrum today is presented by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. And right now, children around the world are living in poverty and facing unimaginable circumstances as a result of COVID-19. And communities in poverty are facing shutdowns and restrictions, just like we are, but without any safety net. And as hardworking day laborers, most of the families Compassion serves work each day in order to buy food for that day and maybe the next. And where many of us have stocked up for days or weeks at a time, they have neither the income or even refrigeration to afford to stay at home. And as a result, parents are forced to make unthinkable choices between going to work and risking infection, or not going to work and facing hunger and starvation. And COVID-19 has multiplied their needs exponentially, and they need help. That's where compassion comes in. That's where you can come in. With Fill the Stadium, a pro-athlete-led initiative raising critical resources for 70,000 children and their families impacted by COVID. Every empty seat represents one child who needs support for the critical next 12 months. This is a stadium that cannot remain empty, and we need your help. You can go to the website, fillthestadium.com. Fillthestadium.com. That's the website. Check it out. You can give, you can donate, and help release these children and their family from poverty. Fillthestadium.com. We're also presented today by Water Mission, and they're a nonprofit Christian engineering ministry fighting the global water crisis with safe water and sanitation and hygiene solutions. And right now they are working to stop the global spread of COVID-19. Urgently needed safe water and sanitation and hygiene solutions. They're providing them, Water Mission is, to refugee settlements and other vulnerable communities. Listen to some of these numbers. These were statistics right before the pandemic. 4.4 billion people lacking access to adequate sanitation. 2.1 billion people lacking access to safe water around the world. These are billion with a B people that don't have adequate sanitation and safe water. Water Mission is stepping in to fill that gap, and you can join them. You can pray with them, and you can donate right now with Water Mission by going to the website watermission.org. Watermission.org, fighting the global water crisis. Watermission.org. You know, you mentioned kind of your faith background and your journey growing up, and, you know, the importance of faith in your family's life and your life. But afterwards, as you begin this process of healing, of forgiveness, and then all of a sudden the success starts to come. And with that comes a lot of notoriety, a lot of the world pulling at you. I'm wondering what God was showing you during those times, and maybe what was your viewpoint of him post, you know, everything that took place in the midst of not when you were first going through it, maybe allowing yourself to be angry at God, but afterwards when the success is coming. And yet you don't want to, what's the Bible say, right? You don't want to conform to the patterns of this world. So I wonder, what was your relationship like with the Lord, you know, as the success started to come your way?
Yeah, you know, those are great questions. And for me, honestly, in so much of my relationship now and growing up with God and my journey in faith and all of that, it's been really rooted in community. And that's, for me, kind of how it shows up in my life, if you will. And so my family and our larger community here at home and beyond that. And so I think that as I worked through that, I really found strength in the idea. I truly do believe that everything happens for a reason, and there's purpose to what we are going through in our lives. And for me, that it was wanting to give that day meaning. I didn't feel like it was a waste. I didn't feel like January 21st, 2008 was just by chance or a fluke. Like, I truly felt like there was a reason why that day happened. And as challenging and difficult as that was, there was a greater meaning to it. And I wanted to find that. And I think that, you know, as I experienced success, yes, I'm very goal driven. And yes, becoming a gold medalist is probably the coolest thing that I could have ever imagined or dreamed of in those first 4 years. I mean, it's still bizarre to me that I went from being paralyzed in 2008 to being a Paralympic gold medalist in 2012. But when I look at that, I think what was so humbling for me is realizing that that moment's about something so much bigger than myself. And that's really what it comes down to, regardless of what higher power you believe in, because I truly do believe, you know, we all, regardless of what, which way we kind of lend our beliefs into, right? Like, I identify as a Christian, but not everyone does. And that's okay. I just think it ultimately comes down to believing in something more than yourself. And And when you do that and you realize that what you're doing, you're small in this bigger equation, that's when magic happens. And I think that was a very humbling part of this journey of, especially early on. Yes, I was working through something so difficult, but once I found the strength and courage to understand that there was meaning, there was purpose to this, and I started seeing the pieces kind of fall in place, I was able to start to kind of move forward with it and allow myself to become who I was meant to be versus fight against it and try to keep going back to where I once was.
You use a word, you haven't used this word yet, but you use it in the book, the word grit. And one of my favorite authors and a good buddy of mine, his name is John Gordon, who is a leadership author. And he's got tons of amazing books on the idea of servant leadership. And he talks about that word grit a lot. You write about that word as well and the importance of grit in your life. Define what grit is and why it is so important for you and has been important for you on your journey.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just grit it's that inner drive to, like, despite everything that gets thrown your way, you keep showing up. Yeah. And I tell people, I think of it as this notion of believing you're superior to circumstance. There's some belief inside where no matter how many times you fall flat on your face, no matter how many times you get pushed down, no matter how many times life kind of throws you punches, there's just that something else that keeps pulling you forward, whatever that is. And for me, I really think that's where grit comes into it. And understanding that it's not going to be easy. It's not supposed to be easy because, quite frankly, we learn the most in our failures, not in our successes. And I think that's where it comes in because, goodness, I mean, imagine if you didn't have that grit and inner drive and the first time you failed, you just threw in the towel. I mean, I wouldn't have even gotten back into the pool in the first place. My first time in the water was when I got in the hospital in pool therapy, and I hated it. I was in tears the entire time, and I vowed to myself I would never return to the water. And then 2 months later, joke was on me because I was getting back into the water. But like, if I didn't listen to that it's like that little inner voice that's just there, and it's nagging, and it tells you no matter how many times you fall to keep going, keep going, keep going. That's grit, and you can't teach it. You can't. You learn it through experience, and I hate to say it, but you learn it through a lot of failure, and that's where it comes from.
Mallory Weggemann's been our guest here on Sports Spectrum. I want to ask you about 2020. If I'm not mistaken, from what I read and doing my research, that was a year where you were supposed to be competing at the Paralympic Games in Tokyo, correct?
That is correct.
So then everything shuts down. And you write about that time in your book. You're in the process of writing a book in the pandemic, which, by the way, I did too. I don't suggest anybody ever do that, by the way, writing a book or releasing a book during a pandemic. But you and I both have done that and are doing that. But you write during that time. The book, again, is called Limitless, at the end, about the lessons you were learning during that time. Can you kind of share a little bit more about what you were working through, especially once the pandemic hit and everything kind of shut down?
Yeah, so the quick backstory that I think made 2020 so emotionally charged for me was I won gold in London in 2012. And then I immediately set my sights on Rio 2016. And 2 years into my journey to Rio, I had a horrific fall and sustained nerve damage to my left arm, which is permanent. I'm still battling it all these years later. And so I didn't know if Rio was even in the cards. I mean, I thought about retiring. I had no idea if I could come back from that. And as we talk about grit, of course, being who I am and being surrounded by the people I'm surrounded by, we decided to fight. And man, did we fight. And I made it to Rio, but I didn't medal in Rio. And, I write a lot about that process of what I learned there, but bringing that into 2020, there was a little bit of unfinished business I had. When I won gold in 2012, I dreamed of winning gold again. And so by the time 2020 rolled around, I'm like, man, I've been on this 8-year hunt to get back to the top of the Paralympic podium. I have faced more hardship again than I probably would have liked. I came home from Rio. I was out for 2 years. I had reconstructive surgeries done. Like, I hit probably the darkest place of my life emotionally in 2017 and 2018. And I finally came out of that, and I was like back into the light, and I finally felt like myself again. And then 2020 hit. I was just like, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, granted, in perspective, 2020 did not just hit me. It hit every single one of us with a vengeance.
Yeah.
And it was really challenging, I think, for all of us. And one of the biggest things I leaned on was when I was paralyzed, I remember for months yearning for life on January 20th, 2008, the day before my life changed. And I wanted so badly to go back to that. And obviously with time, I realized, A, that's just not humanly possible. We cannot go back in time. But B, that's just also not the point. These moments happen in our lives for a reason. And they build us into who we are supposed to be as people. And so what I really leaned on throughout 2020, once the pandemic hit, was instead of fighting it, instead of constantly yearning to go back to here in the US, February when things seemed normal.
Yeah.
What if we just lean into who it's building us into? And so that's for me really, really what I allowed myself to do. And I got to pour myself into my writing on Limitless, which was honestly a really beautiful blessing, because I don't know how I was going to do Limitless the way I wanted to while training for Tokyo and going to Tokyo. But it did take a lot of soul searching. I'm still training hard. Tokyo 2020 will now happen summer 2021. So I'm in the midst of that right now. But I was hoping right now I was going to hopefully be trying to have a family with my husband and be a mom and start living those other aspects of my life that I want to do. And it's only a year. I do understand that, but it's just that reminder I think we've all had at this point where it's like, we're maybe not in the place we thought we would be in March of 2021. But I also think that's okay. And maybe we're not where we thought we would be, but we're exactly where we are meant to be.
Yeah, that's well said. So just so people hear you there, you're training in summer 2021, God willing. We're going for another gold here.
We are going for another gold. Goodness, it'll be 9 years by the time I get to Tokyo this summer. 9 years of fighting for a goal, which makes me maybe a little crazy or just incredibly persistent. I'm not sure which one some days, but I love it. And at the end of the day, I think what energizes me so much is I know that if I do get that opportunity to sit atop a Paralympic podium again, that moment is about something so much larger. And that moment hopefully can be a beacon for another young girl or boy who's looking for their path forward and is looking for that inspiration that in 2008 I was looking for. And that's what it's about. And so
Absolutely.
I think that's what still gets me out of bed each day.
I love it. Well, as we close, my last question, I want to ask specifically about the book, because we told a lot of your story and it's written in this book. But what do you hope people take away when they buy a copy of Limitless, The Power of Hope and Resilience to Overcome Circumstance? That might be your answer, the subtitle of the book. But what do you hope people take away when they go get themselves a copy of your new book, Limitless?
I think the biggest thing that I really found power in when I was writing is this idea that if we can all find the strength to just honor our journey for what it is and allow ourselves to move through it in a way that empowers us, that's where we find our limitless potential. Limitless to me isn't I talk about it's not a fluff statement. It's quite literally a way of being, and that belief that you are more than your circumstance. And I've said many a times that when readers close that last page and turn it over, honestly, if you don't remember a single thing about my story, perfect. Because I hope that when people are reading it, they're not focusing on what was I doing. They're reading it in a way that's encouraging them to look inward at their own journey and find that strength that we all have and allow themselves to really honor theirs and know that we are all worthy of all things splendid, and we all have limitless potential within us. We just have to let ourselves find it. And so for me, that's what Limitless is. And I cannot wait to have it out into the world and sharing it with everyone.
Yeah, people can go get a copy everywhere books are found. Again, it's called Limitless. Mallory Weggemann, congratulations on writing a book. This is a big deal, and I know how hard it is. We were talking before we started recording about just the process and all that you learn when you go through writing a book, which we both have had that experience now. And it's such a cool thing when it actually goes out into the world. It's a little scary too, because now everybody gets to read your words and it's out there forever. But God's doing some great things in your life. I'm sure he's going to continue to do awesome things. And thank you so much for the time and for writing your new book. And hopefully we'll get you back on again sometime. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And many thanks to Mallory Weggemann for joining us today on Sports Spectrum. She's got such a great personality and such a positive outlook when you think about what she went through and the fact that she can't walk anymore. And she remembers exactly what happened in the details and going through all that right before her 19th birthday in 2008. And here we are now in 2021, 13 years later. And Mallory is still making a huge difference. Make sure you go get her book, Limitless. It's available now everywhere books are found. And keep tabs on her because she is making a go for 2021 in the Paralympic Games. And it's exciting to watch her kind of go back into that journey, right? Getting back into the water and seeing if she can do it again and medal one more time. MalloryWeggemanUSA.com is her website. You can check that out as well. MalloryWeggemanUSA.com and give her a follow on social media. Let her know that you heard her story here on Sports Spectrum. Thanks to Mallory for joining us. We also want to thank our partners and sponsors, Water Mission, fighting the global water crisis. Check them out at watermission.org. And of course, our friends at Compassion International and the Fill the Stadium initiative, helping children in crisis. Check out fillthestadium.com to learn more, fillthestadium.com. You can reach us directly as well at sportspectrum.com. And do us a favor, whatever app you're listening to this podcast on, make sure you click that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast. And then lastly, rate, review, and we mentioned subscribe, but rating and review the podcast, reviewing the podcast really helps. It helps a lot. It helps get the word out. So if you can do that, especially on the Apple Podcast app, it takes like 10 seconds. You can rate it, you can review it, helps get the word out. And then lastly, just tell someone, if you like the stories that you're hearing here at Sports Spectrum, the intersection of sports and faith, if you know someone who loves Jesus and loves sports, please do tell them about Sports Spectrum and our Sports Spectrum podcast. As we continue to grow, we continue to look for opportunities to keep this ministry rolling in 2021. And it doesn't happen without you guys. If we don't have listeners, we don't have sponsors, and we don't keep this ministry going. That's plain and simple. So again, thank you so much for tuning in and telling someone about Sports Spectrum, and we'll see you next time right here on the show. My name is Jason. I do hope you all have a great rest of your day, and please do stay safe.